President Yoon Suk Yeol is scheduled to sit down for the NATO summit in Lithuania on Tuesday and Wednesday, marking his second consecutive presence at the world's biggest military alliance, following his first attendance at the gathering in Spain last June. So what is on the agenda at the NATO summit this year? What are the gains of greater collaboration between Korea and NATO? And what are the broader implications of separate summits on the sidelines of NATO? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we offer you a preview of President Yoon Suk Yeol's upcoming agenda at the annual NATO summit being held in Lithuania this year, after which he will travel to Poland for an official visit. For more, I have Professor Min Jeong-hun from the Korea-NATO Diplomatic Academy here in the studio. Professor Min, welcome back.
My pleasure.
I also have Doctor Stephen Noerper at Asia Dialogue live on the line. Dr. Noerper, it's a pleasure to have you back.
A pleasure to be back, Sunny.
Right, Professor Min, President Yoon Suk Yeol has been invited to the NATO summit for 2 years in a row. What do you believe is behind this invitation to President Yoon Suk Yeol?
Yeah, basically, it shows the enhanced the national capabilities of South Korea in relation to the NATO countries. As you mentioned, President Yoon will attend the NATO summit this week, and the presidential office announced that President Yoon will meet the NATO leaders, and they will talk about the Ukraine war, cooperation between the military alliance and the Indo-Pacific region, and the emerging security threats. In addition, the president's office also said that this visit is expected to have the three results. First, strengthening international security cooperation, expanding supply chain cooperation, and promoting South Korea to host the 2030 the World Expo in Busan. So there we can see that the South Korea will discuss with the NATO member states about important international matters like the Ukraine war and security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and the supply chain cooperation. And along with South Korea, other major Asia-Pacific partners or the countries like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand will also invite it to the summit. It shows that major democratic partners and allies around the world will participate in this upcoming summit, and they will discuss about how they will enhance their cooperation to cope with the major international matters. And the fact that South Korea has been invited to the NATO summit for 2 years in a row suggests that South Korea is recognized as an important partner that European countries that want to work together for their own interests and the four major international issues.
Right. And broadly speaking, Dr. Noerper, what does Korea look to gain from greater collaboration with NATO?
Quite a bit, actually. One is, as has just been said, a real penetration in on the European front. There are many issues that do connect South Korea and the Northeast Asia region to Europe. Clearly, there's an overt concern now about the war in Ukraine, so war and peace issues. But more importantly, too, in the longer term, economic issues, trade issues, debt concerns, technology cooperation, all of which shows a real resilience between Europe and Northeast Asia. And so it gives Korea an impetus on behalf of Korean business and in terms of Korean national interests to keep that smooth. Also in terms of national security, as Korea's weighing its concerns about Russian aggression in Ukraine and looking with a very cautious eye toward China in terms of Chinese moves, not only on Taiwan, but concerns about China's role in the broader Northeast Asia area. And of course, Chinese support or certainly an alliance with North Korea. So it behooves South Korea to advance what it has been doing on the global stage, and that is to be extremely active. And just this year alone, to have been active in the G7, and now for the second year in a row, as you said, to be along for this NATO summit.
Right, and staying with Seoul's active role in the global stage, Professor Min, President Yoon is poised to moderate the separate summit that you mentioned about with his counterparts, that is, from Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. On the sidelines of NATO, that is, what do you believe will top the agenda at this latest Asia-Pacific Partners Summit?
Well, it's not clear yet what agendas the four Asia-Pacific partners, which is known as the AP4, will mainly talk about in this upcoming summit. It has been reported by the media that they will talk about how they will work together to respond to China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea, and how they would strengthen their ties with the South Pacific Island, the countries, and other things. But personally, I don't think that they will mainly talk about China's aggressive their actions in the summit, because they have different threat perceptions about China, and they also want to work together with China for their economic interests. So I think that they don't want to talk much about China's aggressive actions or their security concerns against China without the presence of the United States. Instead, I think they will focus on how they work together for the supply chain cooperation in high-tech industries. Each country has its own strength and the capacity in the fields, and therefore enhancing cooperation with each other will benefit for all of them. In addition, they like to talk about how they can strengthen their economic ties with the Pacific Island countries, like the infrastructure, climate change, and other things. So I think that the four Asia-Pacific partners want to enhance their cooperation and strengthen ties on their ties on economic and technological and non-traditional security matters in the summit.
Right, I see. Dr. Noerper, China has not shied away from saying that NATO's outreach in Asia is not welcome. And just last week, its top diplomat Wang Yi called on Seoul and Tokyo to align with Beijing to revitalize Asia. What are the prospects of such a scenario, do you think?
Well, part of it is the definition of what align or realignment means. Clearly, from a Chinese perspective, it means to be cautious in terms of getting too close to the United States, or trilateral coordination among the United States, Korea, and Japan, not to be focused on China solely and exclusively from a Chinese perspective. But I think from a South Korean perspective, it's interesting. Clearly, South Korea has tried not to single out China in its national security strategy. The economic reality is that it will deal with China forward, and there are certainly issues of common concern that Japan, Korea, and China can work upon, issues of climate change, issues of economics, and concern about issues like debt, the next pandemic. So there's quite a bit counterterrorism, many issues on which they can strike at common ground. So what South Korea will be facing is really the challenge of space and how to manage that space in terms of its strong bilateral relationship with the United States, its very strong concern about China's expansion, especially on the military front, and its security designs, but at the same time, the need to work within the framework of healthy trade relations with China and trying to promote responsible Chinese leadership at a time when relations of late between South Korea and China have been difficult, and where South Korean public opinion toward China is not entirely supportive because of its concerns of Chinese mistreatment. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops, and it'll be fascinating within the context of participation at the NATO summit, and given China's concern. But we shouldn't shy away from or ostracize the notion that South Korea would not be dealing with China in a responsible way, whether that's an alignment or realignment. We shouldn't expect it to be too formal, but it is a reality, political, economic, and otherwise.
Right, indeed. Professor Min, Korea, meanwhile, it's expected to sign 11 deals in diverse fields with NATO. Could you tell us a bit about them and their implications?
Yes, and as you mentioned, it's known that South Korea and NATO will adopt the documents for bilateral cooperation across 11 sectors, including non-proliferation, cybersecurity, and emerging technologies. It shows that they become important partners for each other, and they want to work together as global leaders. Specifically, President Yoon's attendance at the NATO summit will help strengthen cooperation with the alliance against North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, and they will send a united message that North Korea's illegal actions would not be tolerated. And when NATO member states support South Korea's policy on North Korea, is very helpful for South Korea to implement its diplomacy and policies in the international stage. In addition, South Korea and NATO countries share their interests in advanced technologies. They have their own strengths and capabilities in the fields, and the enhanced cooperation between them will benefit for each other. And considering that the U.S. is trying to reshape the global supply chain among likely-minded countries, so it is likely that bilateral or multilateral cooperation between South Korea, NATO member states, or European countries will increase in the coming months and years.
Right, hopefully. Dr. Noerper, there had been talk about NATO opening an office in Japan. How likely do you think is this initiative?
Well, right now it faces French opposition. President Macron has made very clear that he sees no need to see NATO expand beyond the North Atlantic concerns. He may be concerned about misperceptions by China in that regard, especially given your earlier question about China's resistance over NATO and Northeast Asia participation. That said, though, I think we're making a little bit much of it in the sense that Japan has had a relationship with NATO for decades now. It has had an office in Brussels since 2018. And whether it's formalized in terms of an office in Tokyo, or whether representations extend to places like Tokyo and Seoul, maybe is less important than the process that's at play, which is that Tokyo and Seoul enjoy good relations with Brussels and with the European capitals for all the reasons that were just outlined, for strategic diversity, for supply chain diversity, for market opportunities. And really, if you examine the two regions, Korea now is looking a lot like Germany and will continue to in terms of its economic prowess in Northeast Asia. And so the relationship and the parallels between Europe and its development and Northeast Asia are fascinating to consider for the longer term for Korea. It is one worth thinking about in the context of this NATO summit.
Right. Professor Min, President Yoon Suk Yeol and his Japanese counterpart, Fumio Kishida, they're also expected to hold a bilateral meeting in Lithuania. What do you suppose will dominate their expected talks?
Well, first, we need to think about the time frame that the two leaders will have in their bilateral the summit. Now, it is known that President Yoon is supposed to have over 10 bilateral meetings with the NATO member states and also moderate the AP4 summit meeting during his visit to Lithuania. It means that many bilateral and multilateral summit meetings will occur during the NATO summit. So it is likely that the bilateral summit between the President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida will not be that long in time frame. So it is expected that with the limited time frame, they will focus on a few agendas. And it has been reported by the media that the two leaders will mainly talk about Japan's wastewater release plan. Okay? And the presidential office said that the President Yoon will focus on prioritizing the health and safety of South Korean people in relation to the Japan's wastewater discharge in the summit. Meanwhile, it seems unlikely that there will be a disagreement about the discharge of the wastewater and the conversation between the two leaders. It's because the South Korean government already mentioned that it respects the IAEA report, and therefore it will maintain its stance based on its policy direction of normalizing or enhancing its relation with Japan.
Right. Moving forward, Dr. Noerper, do you see Russia's prolonged invasion of Ukraine as perhaps serving to bond NATO members closer together, or does it look to create cracks in the long run?
Well, ultimately, there will be a unifying effect because people realize that this type of wanton aggression and the loss of life is dramatic and not appropriate for 2023 and harkens back to the early 20th century type of warfare. There's a tremendous challenge ahead, one in terms of ending the war, and it will require everyone on board for peacemaking initiatives. And then, of course, the reconstruction of Ukraine. And certainly there will be South Korea and another interest in that process. ultimately, too, that will feed into integration processes on the Korean Peninsula. There will be much to learn about the reconstruction of Ukraine forward. But right now, in terms of this NATO summit, it's incredibly important to try to push toward unanimity. That doesn't mean that there are not cracks. Certainly a number have developed. This issue of the United States and Germany showing concern about Ukrainian membership in NATO. But that seems to have been well accepted by President Zelensky, who has suggested that indeed it will be after the conflict ends that Ukrainian membership will be considered. So this is an issue that behooves us all. The Ukrainian crisis is a Northeast Asia concern, as it is for the entire rest of the world. And peaceful resolution of it and the reconstruction of it and dealing with Russian aggression and stemming that type of aggression in the future is one of our foremost concerns and challenges of this era.
Right, of course. And staying with the plight there in Ukraine, Professor Min, some pundits say that the upcoming NATO summit may seek more tangible pledges of support from Korea for Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, so one of the main agendas of the NATO summit will be the Ukraine war. And I think that South Korea will exchange its opinions with the NATO member states about how South Korea will contribute to peace in Ukraine continuously. So I think that South Korea has made significant contributions through diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian assistance. And the South Korea will also will continue its contribution in this way with the NATO member states and the international community. It's like the multilateral, the format. Meanwhile, the South Korea also maintains its principle that it does not provide the lethal weapons to any country in war. And the principle will remain unless it will face an extreme situation where there would be a civilian genocide or serious, grave violation of international law. Although South Korea fully supports the Ukraine to peacefully end the war, but it still considers its relations with Russia still important partner for South Korea.
Right. Dr. Noerper, despite denial by the presidential office here, there is widespread speculation about a possible visit to Ukraine by President Yoon Suk Yeol. Now, that being said, what do you suppose would be the broader implications of such a visit if it does take place, that is?
Well, it would be incredibly important to have South Korean presence in Ukraine, and that type of leaders meeting would be a strong show of support that peace and justice issues are at the foremost concern, that a democratic South Korea identifies the need for legitimacy in the international arena and the rule of law, and that it supports Ukraine not only in terms of military or security provisions, but really in terms of the much broader issue of peace and reconciliation. And again, that will one day come to Korea's fore as well. And so by eliciting support, it shows Korea as an international actor that is globally responsible, one that can help the Ukraine situation, and one that furthers processes of peace and reconciliation that, again, one day will also concern the Korean Peninsula as it moves toward integration and unification.
Right. Professor Min, President Yoon is also poised to fly into Poland after his agenda in Lithuania. What can you share with us about Korea's ties with Poland?
Yes, and President Yoon will visit Poland after the NATO summit, and it will be the 3-day official visit, and it will also be the President Yoon's first bilateral visit to a European nation since taking office. And in Poland, President Yoon will meet the policy president and the prime minister and speakers of both houses of the parliament. So, and they will talk about the strengthening, expanding ties between the two countries, such as trade and investment, arms, nuclear power, and the infrastructure, various aspects of talks. And President Yoon also plans to meet with officials from South Korean businesses operating in Poland who are interested in participating in the reconstruction projects in post-war Ukraine. In the meeting, the President Yoon will discuss ways the South Korean government can support them. And The 89-person business delegation will accompany President Yoon on the trip, and they represent the companies in rechargeable batteries, arms, and nuclear energy, and the construction companies interested in reconstruction projects in Ukraine. So I think that this visit to Poland shows that South Korea expands its ties with Poland in various aspects, and it is also symbolic to show that South Korea is getting closer to European allies and partners.
Right. It's especially the first visit by a South Korean president to Poland after the Lee Myung-bak administration, right?
Right.
Dr. Noerper, broadly speaking, what is your assessment of the Yoon administration's foreign policy thus far amid the current climate of geopolitical tensions?
Well, amidst the climate of tensions, and that clearly means an evolution of blocs where you have seen the United States, Korea, and Japan, along with partners like Australia, New Zealand, India, express concern about China and its ambitions and its expansion, concern about Russia and the aggression in Ukraine. And so clearly trying to stake for democracy has been a gain, and for the cooperation among them, for supply chain resilience, for economic and trade benefits, and for stability. Has been successful in terms of its priorities of reassuring the United States about the strength of the bilateral relationship, and clearly the alliance is strong, this at the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War. And it's also been very strong in terms of repiecing together the relationship with Japan. And given concerns about China, given concerns about Russia, and given concerns about North Korea's military development, having a strong trilateral relationship among the United States, Korea, and Japan is terribly important at the fore. I do think, in relative to the last question as well, it's important meetings with countries like Poland, which have had a long relationship with South Korea. Poland was one of the first countries to recognize South Korea from the former communist bloc at the end of the Cold War. There's a natural complementarity among these diplomatic powers, not just in terms of economic opportunity, but in terms of political relations. And at a time when we're trying to avoid a globe that recesses into bloc confrontation, having a lot of activity at this type of level is important. So state visits to places like Poland are important. Other kinds of European interaction with South Korea is incredibly important. And the dynamics that we see among smaller, middle-level diplomatic powers will help move this along where there are impasses in terms of great power relations. So it shows us South Korea nimble, adept, and one moving forward in creative ways in the international arena.
Right, a very valid point right there, if I may say so myself. Dr. Noerper, as always, thank you very much for your insights. And Professor Min here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Aloha, and thank you.
Right, well, that ends Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday.